Welcome to Voyage Beyond Episode 2, The Forbidden Castle. Voyage Beyond is all about my journey as I dive into the world of concept art. Since I completely forgot in my last video to tell you my process, I'm going to start with that right now. As for the theme, you probably already figured it out because it is the great month of October, so it's obviously going to be Halloween. For this episode, I will be creating a castle and landscape on one layer. Special effects can be on a separate layer. For the first episode, I only used one brush, but for this one, I can use as many brushes as I want. So let the journey begin. To start off this piece, I created a square canvas. I wanted to create a dynamic shot of the castle, so I decided to use 3-point perspective. I usually use 2-point perspective, but I wanted to give it more of a looming presence, and I felt that 3-point perspective did a better job with that. It has been some time since I made any art with 3-point perspective, so it took a little longer than I had hoped. Also, I don't usually draw castles, so that probably added to the time as well. I added some more sharp points to the roof, just for that overall spooky look. I think I used about 13 in all. Finally, I got a rough idea of how I wanted it to look. I then started painting and blocking out the shapes. As you probably noticed, it sped up quite a bit. That's because I got really focused in on the details and it ended up taking a lot longer to paint. After the shapes were blocked out, I started adjusting the values and saturation to bring the forms to life. This took a little bit of time, but I ended up going darker than I was planning just because it gave it more depth. Soon after that, I started adding in shadows. Since I wanted this piece to be illuminated from behind, I focused on making the shadows darker to make the highlights appear to be glowing. It wasn't long before I realized it would have been way easier to do this on multiple layers. Have a castle as one layer, have the foreground as another layer, the background as another layer, maybe that chasm right there as its own layer would have made it a lot easier. But because of my whole scope of this project, I kept it all on one layer. I did this because I wanted to force myself to make a decision and follow through with it. Having one layer definitely did that. Once I got the majority of defining details down, I turned off the sketch. Then I refined some of those details and started adding highlights. Once I got the base highlights painted in, I started adding details. I started with adding texture to the roof and stone walls. After I got most of that done, I started refining the shadows and highlights with more details. To create more depth, I also started adding in bounce light. After that, I went back in and added more contrasting details. Once the castle was pretty well roughed out, I started creating base forms for the landscape. I was focusing on creating more depth between the castle and its surroundings. Almost as soon as I started, I got sidetracked and went right back to working on the castle. Guys, I think I want a castle. After I felt the castle's details were far enough along again, I started back on the landscape. Using some quick selection tools, I quickly adjusted the background and started adding more details. Once the overall shape of the background was roughed out, I started in on the foreground. Using a variety of brushes, I created bushes and grasses growing along the path and down into the chasm. After I got most of that roughed out, I went back in and started defining the shapes. In the background, I stuck with pretty much just one textured brush. It helped me create more complexity without over-defining any of the details. Once that was done, I started experimenting with the special effects. I wanted a very unique glow that came out of the chasm, so after applying a few filters, I ended up with a misty aurora. That wasn't exactly what I was going for, but you know what, it looked pretty cool, so I just went with it. But I didn't want the chasm to be the only thing glowing, so I added some to the castle. I did some quick mock studies, and then I started to finalize the design. And then my computer froze and I lost a few things I had just done. So I decided to start on some clouds and see how that went. It went fine. I used the clouds to kind of create depth between the castle and the mountains behind it. Then I got back to the glowing windows. My computer ended up freezing a few times and I had to restart the glowing windows every time. After having all those issues with the glowing windows, I decided to move on to the moon. After adding a range of darks using textured brushes, I muted the colors and added a glow, and the moon was done. Then I went back to the foreground to add a little bit more depth. I then added some of the chasm's glow into the shadows of the castle. After that, I added in the smoke coming from the castle's chimney. After giving the smoke highlights, contrast, and a beautiful glow, I started on the windows again. I added some more glow and highlights this time, showing off the thickness of the walls, making it actually look like you could see into the castle. I thought I could make ghostly streaks coming from the windows, but I ended up not liking that idea at all. Then I went back and added more edge lighting and highlights to add more contrast to the overall design. The foreground still looked a little dull, so I came back in and started adding some more details. After that was done, I started finalizing the highlights at the base of the castle. For some reason, I really enjoyed painting the grass because it just sort of came alive in this really unique pattern. Once that was done, I brought it into the Camera Raw filter. And then it was done. I ended up having a lot of fun creating this castle. Even though using one layer for the castle and the landscape was difficult, I think it turned out really good. With the moonlight on the path and the glowing forbidden castle looming in the center of the picture, it really reminded me of Scooby-Doo. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you can be the first to see videos when I upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next voyage.